Mark Boston hadn't planned on making enemies in his retirement, nor had he expected that a simple wooden mailbox would mark the beginning of a quiet war. When he bought the single-story ranch house at the end of a cul-de-sac in Arbor Heights, it was with the hope that, after decades working in municipal road maintenance, he'd finally found the kind of stillness that didn't feel like loneliness. Just the comfort of being left alone. The house wasn't extravagant, but he liked its slanted roof, the way the afternoon light hit the porch, and the fact that the property had been kept clean, if not particularly stylish. He had no wife. Anne had passed 10 years earlier, and his son lived 3 states away with a busy job and kids of his own. That suited Mark fine. He had his garage workshop, a collection of good tools, and hands that still remembered the muscle memory of building something that could last longer than the mood of the week. It was the kind of life he had earned, with calluses, overtime hours, and more cold coffee than anyone should admit to drinking. He moved in at the start of spring. The grass in the front yard had grown thick and uneven after the last owner moved out months before, so his first few days were spent mowing and raking, clearing dead branches, and replacing the torn net on the storm door. He noticed the neighbors, of course. Some waved, others glanced from behind blinds. The air here was different, not just in temperature, but in the way people seemed to inhale around you, waiting to see what you'd bring into their pocket of the world. He understood their hesitation. Suburbs aged just like people, some gracefully, others not. The homes were modest, mostly brick with pale siding and attached garages. Many looked the same because they were designed that way, by committee. Some lawns were precise to the inch, others were more chaotic with plastic deer or wind chimes that hadn't been tuned in years. Mark didn't mind either way, though he did prefer function over flair. In his second week, Mark decided to replace the mailbox. The original one was rusted at the hinge and had graffiti faintly scratched into the side, something that looked like a teenager's bored rebellion. Not malice, but still an eyesore. Instead of buying one from the hardware store, Mark spent 2 evenings crafting his own. He had leftover oak from an old fence project back in Ohio, and he planed and sanded the wood until it felt like a finished idea. He inserted a steel rod through the center for stability, stained the exterior to bring out the grain, and welded a small plate to the bottom that would allow him to anchor it deeper than the standard stake. He didn't think of it as defiance. It was just solid work, practical and clean. When he installed it, he felt a flicker of satisfaction, the kind that came from doing something right, not flashy. He didn't expect compliments, but he got a few nods from the mail carrier and an older man walking a dog. That was enough. Then came Karen. Mark had seen her twice before the confrontation. Once when she was dragging a trash bin down her driveway with more force than necessary, and again when she was barking orders at a landscaping crew while pointing at a notepad. She was large, both in frame and presence, with tight curls and a wide-brimmed sun hat that looked like something pulled from a magazine about better living. She didn't smile the way friendly people do. She grinned like someone who had memorized what friendliness should look like. When she walked up to Mark while he was pruning the boxwoods near his porch, she did so with the slow, deliberate steps of someone expecting to be obeyed. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't ask about his day. She simply gestured at the mailbox and said, "That's not compliant with neighborhood guidelines." Mark looked at her, then at the mailbox, then back again. He told her it wasn't obstructing any path, wasn't unsafe, and wasn't in violation of anything that made sense. She didn't argue with logic. She doubled down with tone. "We like things to look uniform here. Clean. Uncluttered. That's why we have rules." Mark, not one to bite quickly, simply said, "Well, it's mine, and it works just fine." That was the end of the conversation, or so he thought. But the next morning, when Mark walked outside with his coffee, he saw the mailbox on the ground, wood splintered and metal bent, the soil around the post disturbed like someone had tried to rip the whole thing out. Next to the wreckage lay a baseball bat. Red grip tape, aluminum, No initials, just left there like punctuation. Mark stood there for a moment, silent. Then he bent, picked up the remains, and carried them into the garage. He didn't call the police right away. He took photos first. Not for vengeance, but for insurance. Habit, perhaps, from decades of documenting incidents that could become liability claims. When he finally called, the officer on the phone asked a few perfunctory questions. Any witnesses? Do you have security footage? Did you see who did it? The usual script. Mark answered honestly. No, and no. The bat didn't have fingerprints visible to the eye. The officer said someone might stop by, but it wasn't likely to lead anywhere. Mark said fine and hung up. He wasn't surprised. Things like this didn't go far unless someone made a scene, and he wasn't the type. That afternoon, Mark drove to a local supplier and bought 3 bags of quick-set concrete, a length of rebar, and a cast-iron pipe. He knew exactly what he was going to build. He didn't feel angry, not the hot kind, anyway. It was something colder, slower. Not rage, but resolve. If someone wanted to destroy his work, they'd have to try harder next time. In the garage, he laid out the materials like a surgeon prepping for a long, necessary procedure. The core of the new mailbox would be a reinforced post, encased in concrete and sunk nearly 3 feet into the ground. He framed it with pressure-treated lumber and added reflective tape to the back side. He wasn't trying to hurt anyone, just make a point that permanence still had a place in the world. He finished late, sweat soaking through his undershirt, knuckles scraped, but it stood upright, heavy, and unapologetic. It wasn't just a mailbox. It was a statement. You don't knock me down that easy. The next day, Karen stood at the end of her driveway, arms crossed, watching. Mark didn't wave. She didn't speak. But something passed between them in that silence. A shift. She'd taken the first swing. He'd answered with weight. There were no words necessary, not yet. But everyone on the street saw the new mailbox, and they knew. It wasn't going anywhere. And that was only the beginning. Mark had lived long enough to know that real trouble rarely announced itself with noise. It came quietly, seeping into the seams of your life until it found something to tear open. 3 days after he set the new mailbox, just as the sun was starting to stretch long orange fingers across the street, he noticed something different. A small slip of paper, weighted under a pebble, stuck into the corner of his front step. Mark bent down slowly, the familiar groan of tired knees greeting him as he picked it up. The note was written in fat, aggressive handwriting, the ink smudged at the edges as if the writer had pressed down too hard with the pen. It said simply, "Next time, it won't be the box." No signature, no symbols, just that stark warning, as cold and clear as frost on a window. He stared at it for a long moment, turning it over in his hand, feeling the thickness of the paper. Not standard printer stock. This was heavier, almost like something you would use for announcements or flyers. It wasn't random. It wasn't kids playing a prank. This was deliberate, and Mark knew exactly who was behind it, even if he hadn't seen it happen. Still, assumptions weren't the same as proof, and Mark wasn't a fool who acted on emotions alone. He slid the note into a manila folder he kept in his kitchen drawer, the same one where he now stored the photos of the broken mailbox and the police report number scrawled hastily on a post-it. He wasn't going to start a shouting match in the street. He was going to do what men like him did best: document, prepare, endure. That night, he slept lightly, the kind of half-sleep where every sound outside pulls you halfway to waking. Around 3 a.m., he heard a car engine idle a little too long outside his house, but when he looked through the blinds, it was already gone, just a pair of dimming taillights disappearing around the corner. Mark didn't chase after it. He knew better. He made a mental note of the time and went back to bed, his body heavy but his mind restless. By the following morning, something else had changed. The air felt thicker somehow, as if the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. When Mark went to collect his mail, still proudly delivered into the new concrete-reinforced box, he noticed several of his neighbors watching him from their porches or behind slightly parted curtains. It wasn't curiosity, it was calculation. He was being measured now, weighed against whatever narrative was already starting to spread. That's how it worked in places like this. You didn't have to shout to start a fire. You just had to whisper the right story to the right ears. He didn't waste energy wondering what lies were being spun. He had more important things to do. After breakfast, Mark drove down to the county records office. He knew that if things escalated, he needed every scrap of official documentation in his corner. He requested copies of the neighborhood regulations. Not the summaries passed around in welcome packets, but the full, binding agreements recorded with the county. It took a few hours, but he walked out with a thick envelope under his arm and a mind already turning over strategies. Knowledge was armor, and if this was turning into a siege, he wasn't going to be caught with his shield down. That afternoon, as Mark sat at his dining room table highlighting key sections of the documents, a knock came at the door. Not the casual, two-fingered tap of a neighbor borrowing sugar, but a firm, insistent knock that demanded attention. Mark stood, stretched the tightness from his lower back, and opened the door. Karen stood there, blocking most of the afternoon sun, wearing a pastel sweater and clutching a clipboard to her chest like a shield. Her lips were pursed into a sour line. "We're having a community review," she said without greeting. "Concerns have been raised about modifications to property fixtures without approval." She held out the clipboard as if presenting a warrant. Mark didn't move to take it. "What concerns?" he asked evenly. Karen's eyes darted once to the mailbox, then back to him. "Safety concerns. Uniformity concerns. You can't just install something like that without clearance. It's disruptive. It's an eyesore. It could injure someone." Mark held her gaze, his face a careful mask of patience. "It's my property," he said, "and I have confirmed that it complies with setback requirements, height restrictions, and material guidelines. There's nothing in the recorded covenants that dictates what a mailbox must be made of." Karen's mouth twitched, a muscle in her jaw working as if chewing over words she wasn't sure she should say aloud. Instead, she simply shoved the clipboard an inch closer. "You've been informed. We expect corrective action within 10 days, or we'll escalate the matter." Mark took the clipboard then, not to humor her but to document the interaction. He skimmed the paper. It wasn't an official notice from any governing body. It was a petition, poorly worded and signed by maybe a half-dozen neighbors, none of whom had bothered to speak to him directly. He set the clipboard gently back into her hands. "Duly noted," he said. "Good day, Karen." He closed the door firmly but without slamming it. Then he locked it, not because he was afraid, but because it was time to treat his home like a castle, as every man should when the world outside starts pushing harder than it should. That night, as Mark sat on his porch with a cup of black coffee growing cold beside him, he thought about what escalation might look like. It wouldn't be another baseball bat, he suspected. Too obvious. No. If Karen and her little cabal wanted to break him, it would be with paperwork, with fines, with endless nuisance complaints that bled time and energy until he either cracked or capitulated. It was a coward's war, fought with bureaucracy and the weight of numbers. Mark had seen it before, in different forms, in city offices and in private disputes between neighbors over things like tree roots and fence lines. The trick wasn't to fight every battle. It was to know which hill to die on, and which ones to simply build taller walls around. He turned the coffee cup in his hands, feeling the cooling ceramic, and listened to the sound of a distant dog barking once, twice, before silence reclaimed the night. There was a part of him, the younger part that had gotten into bar fights over less, that wanted to rip the problem out by the roots. But that wasn't how he won anymore. He would not be dragged down into shouting matches or petty displays. He would make every move matter. The next morning, true to form, a brightly colored notice was taped to his door. It wasn't from law enforcement. It wasn't from any county inspector. It was from Karen's so-called community group, accusing him of creating a hostile environment and demanding a meeting to address grievances. Mark read it once, then set it carefully into the manila folder with the rest of his growing collection. He wasn't going to their meeting. He wasn't going to acknowledge their authority. He was going to continue living as he had planned, with dignity, with patience, and with the slow, steady force of someone who understood that real strength wasn't loud. It was heavy, immovable, and impossible to ignore. In the days that followed, the petty aggressions multiplied. His trash cans were knocked over twice. A small, dead shrub was left on his front lawn, roots torn and exposed like an accusation. He found a scratch running deep along the side of his truck. Not accidental, but purposeful. A message carved in dull lines. Through it all, Mark said nothing. He documented. He replaced. He reinforced. Each act of quiet resilience drove them a little crazier, because they couldn't make him dance to their tune. The battle had been joined not with fire or fists, but with slow, deliberate siege, and Mark was ready. The mailbox had been just the first stone in the wall he was building around himself. And when the final test came, when they pushed too far, he would be more than ready to answer. He was already answering, just not in the language they understood. The attack, when it finally came, was so blatant that even Mark, who had prepared himself for a slow, grinding siege of pettiness and bureaucratic sabotage, had to pause for a moment just to absorb the audacity of it. It was just after 6 in the morning. A soft mist still clinging to the asphalt like a forgotten memory of the night before, when the loud, metallic crunch echoed through the quiet neighborhood like a gunshot. Mark, already awake and standing in his kitchen pouring his first cup of coffee, froze at the sound. He knew instinctively it wasn't the usual early commuter traffic or a delivery van rumbling by too close to the curb. This was something different. This was impact, unmistakable and heavy. He set down the coffee and stepped outside onto the porch, the screen door creaking lightly behind him. The sight that greeted him was almost comical in its absurdity, if not for the implications it carried. Karen's massive white SUV was nose-deep into his concrete mailbox, the front grille crumpled like a discarded soda can. Plastic and metal shards littering the driveway and the curb like confetti from a parade no one had wanted to attend. Steam hissed softly from the buckled hood, and through the cracked windshield Mark could see Karen's furious, wide-eyed face contorted into an expression of equal parts rage and disbelief. Mark did not run toward the wreck. He did not shout. He simply walked, slow and measured, across the lawn, arms loose at his sides. Other doors on the street were starting to open now. Heads poked out cautiously, phones appeared in hands, not lifted for recording, not yet, but present, just in case. Mark knew how important it was to stay controlled, to be the image of calm in the storm that someone else had summoned. Karen stumbled out of her SUV, her body awkward and heavy with adrenaline. She was shouting before her feet even fully hit the ground, voice shrill and slicing through the mist. "This is your fault," she screamed, pointing a trembling finger at Mark. "You set a trap, you malicious bastard. You're going to pay for this. You hear me?" Mark stopped a good 20 feet away, more than enough distance to be unimpeachable in any later retelling. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't match her hysteria. He simply said, "You hit a stationary object on private property, Karen." She shook her head violently, wild curls bouncing. "That thing's a menace. It's a danger to the whole neighborhood. It's illegal. You set it up to hurt someone." Mark raised an eyebrow, tilting his head slightly as if considering the words carefully, as if giving them weight they didn't deserve. "You drove your car into it, Karen. How exactly do you figure that's my fault?" By now, more neighbors had gathered. Some stood in their driveways pretending to check their mail or adjust a garden hose. Others simply stared openly. Mark recognized the hunger in their eyes, not for justice, not for truth, but for drama. They wanted blood, any blood, and they didn't care whose it was. Karen, breathing hard, gestured wildly toward the gathering crowd. "You all saw it. You saw how dangerous it is. He's a menace. He's unstable." A small, elderly woman down the block coughed lightly, looking profoundly uncomfortable, but said nothing. No one did. No one rushed to Karen's defense. The silence stretched taut, an invisible line snapping tighter with every second she ranted. Finally, one of the newer residents, a man Mark only knew as David, called out from across the street. "You hit a mailbox, Karen," he said, his voice carrying easily. "Maybe slow down next time." Karen whirled toward him, sputtering, but David had already turned and walked inside, closing his door with a quiet finality that spoke louder than any words. Mark felt a flicker of grim satisfaction, but he didn't let it show. He knew better. He stood there, hands in his jacket pockets, and waited. Sure enough, within minutes, 2 police cruisers pulled onto the street, lights flashing but sirens off. Officers stepped out, taking in the scene with professional detachment. One approached Mark while the other moved toward Karen, who was still gesticulating wildly beside her damaged vehicle. The officer addressing Mark was young but had the wary posture of someone who had seen a fair share of domestic disputes and wanted nothing more than to write his report and leave before things got messier. "Sir," the officer said, clipboard in hand, "can you tell me what happened?" Mark nodded once. "I was inside my home, heard the impact, came outside, found this." He gestured calmly at the crumpled SUV and the undisturbed concrete mailbox. The officer scribbled a few notes, asked for ID, asked if there were any security cameras. Mark told him the truth. No cameras on his property, but he encouraged the officer to check with the surrounding homes. Mark had a feeling that at least a few of his quieter neighbors would be willing to cooperate now that they saw how reckless the situation had become. Meanwhile, Karen's voice, shrill and desperate, carried over the lawn. "It's a weapon. He built a weapon to hurt me. I demand he be arrested." The second officer, an older man with a grizzled beard, was clearly less impressed. Mark saw the slight narrowing of the man's eyes, the way his hand casually adjusted the position of his belt as he shifted his weight. He'd seen that look before, in union halls, in budget meetings, the look of a man who knew nonsense when he heard it. Eventually, after some terse exchanges and a lot of scribbling, the officers separated the parties and took statements from a handful of onlookers. They conferred by the squad cars for a few minutes before returning. The younger officer spoke first. "Sir, at this time we are documenting this as a motor vehicle accident involving private property. Ms. Lewis," he nodded toward Karen, "has indicated she may pursue civil action, but from a criminal standpoint there's no charge we can apply." Mark nodded once. "Understood." Karen exploded again, but this time the officers cut her off swiftly, their patience clearly running thin. They issued her a citation for reckless driving and for operating an unsafe vehicle. Her inspection sticker was months out of date, something Mark hadn't even noticed but that the officers, to their credit, had picked up on. As the officers wrapped up their scene work, Karen sat heavily on the curb, defeated but still seething, glaring at Mark with a hatred so raw it almost seemed childish. Mark didn't return the glare. He simply turned, walked back across his lawn, and disappeared into his house without looking back. Inside, he allowed himself a single deep breath, releasing the tension that had settled into his shoulders. He had survived the first major assault. His defenses had held. But he knew this wasn't over. Karen wasn't the kind to accept defeat gracefully. She would regroup, reframe the narrative, find another way to lash out. That was her nature. Mark sat at his kitchen table, the early sunlight filtering through the window, painting long lines across the paperwork he had spread there. He pulled out a legal pad and began to write, not in anger, not in panic, but with methodical calm. Timeline of Events, he titled it. Below, he began listing dates, times, incidents. He attached copies of the police report numbers. He cross-referenced notes from the neighborhood regulations he had retrieved. This wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. If Karen was going to turn this into a campaign, Mark would be ready. And so he wrote, steady and unflinching, building his own wall of paper and facts, stone by stone, word by word. When he finished, he sat back, poured himself a fresh cup of coffee, and stared out the window at the battered mailbox still standing stubbornly at the edge of his lawn. A scar, perhaps, but also a banner. A silent reminder that some things, once built right, simply refuse to fall. Mark smiled thinly. Let them come. He was just getting started. 2 days passed after the collision without another direct confrontation, but Mark knew better than to believe the silence meant surrender. He understood the nature of people like Karen. When brute force failed, they turned to whispers and paperwork, slow erosion instead of frontal assault. True to form, the next move came not under the cover of darkness but through a thin, white envelope tucked neatly into his mailbox, bearing no return address but carrying an unmistakable stench of malice. The letter inside was written on official-looking stationery with a generic community association header, and contained carefully vague language about ongoing concerns regarding non-compliance with community standards and actions necessary to restore neighborhood harmony. It ordered Mark to attend a hearing scheduled at the community clubhouse, to discuss the resolution of grievances, and consider potential corrective measures. Though it was phrased in civil terms, the real message was clear: fall in line or face consequences. Mark read it twice, then set it on the table and went to pour himself a coffee. He wasn't surprised. He had expected escalation, just not so quickly. He debated briefly ignoring the notice altogether, but something in the wording stuck with him. Consider corrective measures. It wasn't an invitation. It was a warning. Ignoring it could be construed as non-cooperation, giving them ammunition he had no intention of handing over freely. Better to face it head-on, eyes wide open on his own terms. When the evening of the hearing arrived, Mark dressed with deliberate care, dark jeans, clean boots, a button-down shirt, simple but neat. He understood that battles weren't always won with facts. Sometimes they were won with appearances, with the image of being reasonable, respectable, composed. As he walked the short distance to the clubhouse, he caught glimpses of movement behind curtains, saw doors shift slightly open as neighbors peered out. Let them watch, he thought. Let them see who they were trying to drag through the mud. The clubhouse was a bland, beige building, once intended for cheerful gatherings, but now serving as the setting for the kind of petty bureaucratic drama that slowly poisoned communities from the inside out. Inside, folding chairs had been arranged in neat rows facing a long table where 3 figures sat, papers neatly stacked before them. Karen was seated in the center, her face set in a grim line, flanked by 2 others Mark barely recognized. Margaret, a bird-like woman with a permanent frown, and Stan, a doughy man who seemed perpetually uncomfortable no matter where he was. There were about 15 other people scattered among the chairs, most of them residents Mark had seen but never really spoken to, faces caught somewhere between interest and wariness. He could feel their eyes on him as he walked calmly to one of the empty seats, sitting down with the relaxed posture of a man who had nothing to apologize for. Karen wasted no time. She banged a small gavel on the table, the sound sharp in the dead room. "We are here to address ongoing concerns regarding Mr. Boston's non-compliant installation and its impact on neighborhood safety and aesthetics, she announced, her voice carrying the rehearsed sharpness of someone who had practiced it in front of a mirror. Mark said nothing, simply folding his hands in his lap, letting her talk. Let them lay it all out, expose their hand fully. Karen continued, flipping through her papers with unnecessary drama. Several residents have expressed concerns about the aggressive nature of the structure installed by Mr. Boston at the edge of his property. We have documented damage caused to a vehicle, and there are fears about potential injury to pedestrians, children, and pets. Mark noted the careful omission of the fact that the damage had occurred because someone had plowed their SUV into a stationary object. Details, it seemed, were an inconvenience to their narrative. We are recommending, Karen said, pausing to make sure everyone was watching, that Mr. Boston be required to remove the current mailbox installation and replace it with one conforming to traditional community standards under review and approval of the association. Murmurs rippled through the small audience, some supportive, others hesitant. Mark caught one man, David, again, rolling his eyes subtly. It gave him a flicker of hope. Not everyone had swallowed the story whole. Karen finished and turned to Mark with a syrupy smile. Would you like to respond, Mr. Boston? Mark stood slowly, ensuring his movements were deliberate and unthreatening. He pulled a folder from under his arm and approached the table, placing copies of official county regulations, property boundary maps, and photographs of the intact mailbox and collision scene before each board member. My installation, Mark began, his voice steady and low, is in compliance with municipal regulations regarding structure placement and material use. There are no prohibitions against reinforced materials. There are no restrictions against mailbox construction so long as it does not obstruct public access or violate property boundaries. Furthermore, the damage cited as evidence against me occurred because a private vehicle left the roadway and struck a stationary object. If there is a concern regarding traffic safety, perhaps we should be discussing driver responsibility rather than property rights. He let the words hang there, not rushing to fill the silence. Stan coughed awkwardly, glancing at Karen, who flushed an ugly shade of red. Margaret frowned deeper, peering at the documents but not seeming to actually read them. It didn't matter. Mark wasn't playing for their approval. He was speaking to the room, to the undecided faces watching from the chairs. He turned, addressing them directly now. I moved here because I believed this was a community that respected hard work and personal responsibility. I didn't realize I was moving into a place where defending your property from vandalism made you the villain. A ripple of discomfort passed through the audience. A few heads nodded, small, almost imperceptible, but enough. Karen slammed her hand on the table, abandoning all pretense. This isn't about property. It's about attitude. We don't need troublemakers here. Mark smiled then, a slow, patient smile that was more effective than any retort. Then perhaps you should stop trying to make trouble where there isn't any. The tension in the room shifted, subtly but perceptibly. Karen realized it too late. Her tantrum had undermined the very narrative she had so carefully constructed. Mark had not raised his voice, had not made wild accusations. He had simply stood his ground, armed with facts and calm dignity. The meeting broke down after that. No official vote was held. No actions were mandated. Instead, a lot of muttering and paper shuffling ensued, with Karen trying to regain control of the meeting but failing as people quietly filtered out, not wanting to be associated with the sinking ship. Mark left last, walking slowly back toward his house under the watchful eyes of the neighbors who, for now at least, seemed to have seen enough to reconsider the side they wanted to be on. The war wasn't over. He knew that. Karen's type didn't quit after one public embarrassment. She would come back, find new ways to provoke, new lies to spread. But for the first time, the momentum had shifted. Mark wasn't just defending anymore, he was starting to win. And as he stood on his porch that night, sipping his coffee and staring out at the darkened street, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a deep, unshakable certainty that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he needed to do. He wasn't just surviving the siege, he was outlasting it. The first warning that the battle was far from over came early one morning, a week after the failed meeting at the clubhouse. Mark was repairing a section of his backyard fence when he heard the now familiar crunch of tires pulling up near his property. A slow, deliberate stop rather than a neighbor coming and going on routine business. Wiping his hands on a rag, he rounded the side of the house just in time to see two unfamiliar men in collared shirts and khakis stepping onto his lawn, one holding a thick envelope in his hand like a badge of authority. Their postures were relaxed but calculating, the way men move when they believe they're backed by paperwork and hidden alliances. Mark didn't wait for them to knock. He met them halfway across the yard, boots scraping against the gravel path, posture steady. "Can I help you?" he asked, already knowing the answer would be something he wouldn't appreciate. One of the men, a shorter fellow with a clipped gray mustache, smiled with the practiced smoothness of someone used to delivering bad news under a mask of professionalism. "Good morning, sir. We're here on behalf of the Neighborhood Review Board. We need to conduct a site inspection regarding non-compliance concerns raised by multiple residents." Mark didn't smile back. "You mean Karen," he said simply. The man's smile didn't falter, but his eyes flickered. "We're required to act on all formal complaints regardless of origin," he said smoothly. "May we proceed?" Mark crossed his arms. "Do you have a warrant or court order?" The second man, taller and more stoic, cleared his throat and produced a sheaf of papers from the envelope. Per community bylaws, a review, board-approved inspection of exterior properties can be requested under Section 6, Paragraph 12. He held it out, the legalese printed in tight, uninviting lines. Mark took the papers, scanning them quickly. It was real, or at least real enough to cause trouble if he refused. He had done his homework. He knew there were clauses like this tucked into the fine print, designed to protect against genuine safety hazards like broken retaining walls or overgrown trees blocking sight lines. Still, this wasn't that. This was harassment dressed up in regulation. He stepped aside without comment, gesturing toward the mailbox and the lawn beyond. Let them look. Let them dig for infractions that didn't exist. The two men spent the next half hour walking the property, clipboards scratching occasionally as they noted down measurements, snapped photos, and murmured to each other. Mark watched them from the porch, arms resting lightly on the railing, his face unreadable. He didn't interfere. That would have played right into their hands. Let them waste their time. Finally, they returned, expressions carefully neutral. "You'll receive a full report by mail," the mustached one said. "If corrective actions are required, you'll have 30 days to comply." Mark nodded once. "You gentlemen have a good day." They left without further incident, but Mark knew better than to relax. This wasn't about finding violations. This was about manufacturing them. 3 days later, the letter arrived. A list of supposed infractions, petty, laughable things that strained the very definition of non-compliance. The mailbox was cited for potential hazard to vehicular traffic, despite being set well back from the curb. His backyard shed, which had been standing for 20 years before he bought the place, was listed as unauthorized structure pending certification. Even his front lawn was flagged for non-uniform grass growth, as if natural variation was now a punishable offense. It was so absurd Mark almost laughed. But he didn't. Laughter would have been a luxury, and he was at war. He called his attorney that afternoon, a no-nonsense woman named Linda Cole he had worked with before during a property line dispute at his old house. She listened patiently as he laid out the situation, asked sharp, pointed questions, and then gave her verdict. "They're trying to bury you under paper," she said. "It's classic low-grade harassment. Death by 1,000 citations. They're hoping you'll either give up and move or rack up so many fines you'll have to sell. It's happened before." Mark grunted, the sound low in his throat. "What are my options?" Linda was blunt. "Fight every charge. File responses to each violation. Request independent inspections. Demand documentation of enforcement history to prove selective enforcement if necessary. Make it as expensive and time-consuming for them as they're making it for you. Turn the tactic back on them. It would be exhausting, it would be tedious, but it was doable." Mark agreed, and they began the slow, methodical counteroffensive. Every citation was answered with certified letters demanding proof. Every request for modification was met with requests for precedent. Every accusation was dragged into the light where it could shrivel under scrutiny. Meanwhile, Karen escalated in her own way. Flyers began appearing in mailboxes up and down the street, unsigned but unmistakably hers. They warned of dangers lurking behind reinforced structures, hinted at unregistered weapons training taking place on Mark's property, a ludicrous accusation made all the more ridiculous by its vagueness. Mark collected each flyer carefully, photographing them, adding them to the growing file he was building. Then came the night the power went out. Mark had just sat down with a book when the entire house flickered and plunged into darkness. At first, he assumed it was a normal outage. Old lines, a blown transformer maybe. But when he stepped outside, he saw that the streetlights were still on, neighboring homes glowing warmly in the distance. Only his house sat in a pool of unnatural shadow. His instincts, honed over a lifetime of dealing with both machinery and men, kicked in immediately. He moved cautiously around the perimeter, flashlight steady, senses sharp. It didn't take long to find the problem. A clean, deliberate cut in the power line leading into the side of his house, the work of someone who knew exactly where to slice to cause maximum disruption with minimal noise. Mark didn't call the police right away. First, he documented everything: photographs, timestamps, detailed notes. Then he called Linda, who advised filing a formal police report but cautioned him against any confrontation without proof. He followed her advice. The police came, took statements, made sympathetic noises about kids and pranks, but Mark could see in their eyes the reluctance to dig deeper. No video, no witness, no suspect. Another file number, another dead end, for now. The next morning, he called an electrician and had the line repaired and fortified with protective sheathing, making it harder to tamper with in the future. He also quietly had a small security system installed, not flashy, not obvious, but enough to cover his property's blind spots. He didn't tell anyone. Let them think they were still unseen. The second wave of citations came within the week, an almost laughable escalation citing unauthorized modifications to utility access. Mark responded with counterclaims supported by invoices and professional certifications. He flooded their process with so much paperwork that processing it would take months. Through it all, Mark remained outwardly calm. He mowed his lawn, tended his roses, repaired the fence panels rattled loose by spring winds. He waved politely to passing neighbors, some of whom waved back now, sheepishly, as if they had started to realize the narrative wasn't as clear-cut as Karen had painted. Still, the attacks wore on him. Sleep grew fitful. Meals lost their taste. The constant vigilance, the background hum of impending confrontation, took its toll in ways even Mark's steady temperament couldn't entirely deflect. He fought it the only way he knew how, with work, with preparation, with relentless documentation. And as the spring deepened into a hot, heavy summer, he knew the real showdown was approaching. Karen wouldn't back off. She couldn't afford to, not after investing so much into her personal crusade. Mark didn't fear her, But he respected the danger she represented, the way small, petty malice could accumulate into something genuinely destructive if left unchecked. So he watched. He waited. And when the next blow came, he would be ready, more ready than she could possibly imagine. The final breaking point came not with another letter, not with another flyer tucked into mailboxes or another manufactured citation, but with a direct, reckless act that left no room for interpretation. It happened late one humid Saturday evening, the heavy air clinging to everything like a wet sheet, when Mark, tired after a day spent repairing an old wooden bench in the backyard, decided to sit on his porch with a cold beer and simply watch the sun sink behind the line of trees at the far end of the street. The neighborhood was unusually quiet, a strange stillness that prickled at the back of his mind but didn't quite translate into conscious alarm. It began with a low rumble, the unmistakable sound of an engine pushed harder than it should be, a vehicle accelerating far too fast for the narrow residential street. Mark sat up straighter, instinct immediately on alert, eyes narrowing as he scanned the road. And then he saw it. Karen's battered white SUV, repaired just enough to run, barreling down the street toward his property. The high beams were on, glaring and wild, the vehicle weaving slightly from side to side as if daring the world to get in its way. Mark didn't move. He stayed seated, hands steady around the sweating glass of his beer, heart pounding but mind ice cold. He watched, calculating distance, speed, trajectory. She wasn't aiming for the mailbox this time. She was aiming for him. At the last possible second, he shifted sideways off the chair, rolling his body with the practiced precision of someone who understood that time was measured differently when life itself was on the line. The SUV skidded, tires screaming against the asphalt, and clipped the edge of his porch with a sickening crunch of wood splintering under steel. The impact threw debris across the yard, shattered a support beam, and sent the chair Mark had been sitting on tumbling into the hedges. Karen's vehicle jerked to a halt halfway across Mark's lawn, the engine coughing once before stalling into a shuddering silence. For a long moment, everything froze. The world reduced to the high whine of adrenaline in Mark's ears, the faint crackle of the broken porch timber settling. Then Karen's door swung open and she stumbled out, face flushed, mouth working wordlessly before finding its voice. "You're the threat here," she screamed, the words slurring slightly. "You're ruining everything. You don't belong here." Mark didn't respond. He didn't move toward her. He simply pulled his phone from his pocket with calm deliberation and dialed 911, his voice steady when the dispatcher answered. He reported the incident, his address, described the damage, and stated clearly that he was uninjured, but that the driver appeared to be under the influence. Within minutes, flashing lights bathed the street in harsh red and blue. Neighbors flooded out of their homes, drawn by the spectacle they could no longer pretend wasn't happening. Officers emerged from their cruisers, moving with brisk professional efficiency, separating Mark from Karen, who by now had collapsed against the crumpled front bumper of her SUV, sobbing and shouting incoherently about conspiracies and betrayal. The officers quickly assessed the scene. Breathalyzer tests were administered, and Mark watched from a distance as the small digital readout confirmed what he had already suspected. Karen was over the legal limit, significantly so. Her eyes widened in outrage when the handcuffs came out, the reality of consequences descending upon her like a weight she had never imagined she would have to bear. "You can't do this to me," she shrieked as they led her toward the waiting cruiser. "I'm on the board. I have rights." The older of the two officers, a grim-faced woman with no patience for such nonsense, simply responded, "Not tonight, ma'am," and pushed Karen's head down gently as she guided her into the back seat. Mark gave his statement calmly, methodically, laying out the facts without embellishment. He showed the officers the damaged porch, the tire tracks tearing up his lawn, the debris strewn across the yard. Several neighbors corroborated his account, some timidly, others with surprising firmness. David, the man who had spoken up during the meeting weeks before, stood beside Mark and nodded when the officers took his testimony, his quiet presence a steady anchor in the swirling chaos. By the time the police finished processing the scene, filing their reports, and towing Karen's vehicle away for evidence, the neighborhood had fallen into a thick, uneasy silence. The reality of what had just occurred settled over the street like a smothering blanket. This wasn't about disagreements over mailboxes anymore. This was about one person's reckless hatred boiling over into violence, and no amount of gossip or whispered campaigns could cover it up now. Mark watched the last of the cruisers pull away, the flashing lights fading into the distance. He stood alone on his battered porch, surveying the wreckage, the twisted beams and shattered steps that had, moments ago, been the peaceful threshold of his home. He felt tired, not the weariness of a man defeated, but the deep, bone-level exhaustion of someone who had endured a siege and seen it through to the bitter end. Inside, he poured himself another beer and sat down at the kitchen table, letting the quiet fill the house. He knew the legal wheels would now turn in his favor. Criminal charges would be filed against Karen. DUI, reckless endangerment, destruction of private property. Civil suits would follow, perhaps even a restraining order. The legal system moved slowly, but it moved, and this time he wouldn't have to push it uphill alone. In the days that followed, the neighborhood shifted subtly but unmistakably. The looks he received from neighbors were no longer tinged with suspicion or hesitation, but with something closer to respect, and, in some cases, regret. Lawn chairs appeared at the edge of driveways again. Children played in front yards without furtive glances over shoulders. Without Karen's heavy shadow looming over every interaction, the community began, slowly, almost shyly, to breathe again. Mark accepted the tentative greetings and brief conversations with polite reserve. He wasn't looking for friends or accolades. He hadn't fought this battle for anyone but himself, to protect his home, his dignity, his right to live without fear of petty tyrants dictating the terms of his existence. Repairs to the porch began almost immediately. Mark insisted on doing much of the work himself, replacing the broken beams with stronger wood, reinforcing the steps, repainting the trim. He wasn't interested in erasing the damage entirely. He wanted the scars visible, a reminder of the price of standing firm. On the afternoon the last coat of paint dried, he installed a new mailbox post at the edge of his property. It was even sturdier than the first, reinforced steel core, concrete foundation, polished oak exterior, subtle, solid, and utterly immovable. And on the front, in small engraved brass letters, he mounted a plaque that simply read, "Built to Last." As the summer deepened and the days stretched long and hot, Mark returned to his quiet routines. Coffee on the porch in the mornings, slow walks through the garden in the evenings, projects in the garage that would never quite be finished, and he wouldn't have it any other way. Karen was gone. Her house sold at a loss to a young couple who immediately stripped away the gaudy decorations she had so proudly displayed. The board she had once ruled with an iron fist quietly dissolved and reformed under new leadership. People more interested in potlucks and clean parks than witch hunts and personal vendettas. Mark didn't involve himself in the politics. He didn't need to. He had won the only battle that mattered, the right to live his life on his terms, without fear, without apology. And every morning, as he retrieved his mail from the unyielding box standing proudly at the edge of his property, he felt a quiet, unshakable satisfaction. Some things, once built right, simply refused to fall. By the time the first cool winds of early autumn brushed across Arbor Heights, the rhythm of life had shifted so thoroughly that it almost felt as if the summer's chaos had been nothing more than a fever dream. The house that had once belonged to Karen stood quiet and empty for a time, the overgrown hedges and peeling paint a fitting testament to her downfall. Eventually, a new family moved in, a young couple with 2 small children and a black Labrador that barked enthusiastically at every falling leaf. They kept to themselves at first, cautious but polite, and Mark returned their cautious greetings with a nod, a small gesture of welcome that expected nothing in return. He had no interest in controlling or being controlled. His battles had never been about dominance, but about the simple, immutable right to live peacefully without harassment or petty tyranny. The changes in the neighborhood were subtle at first, like a wound healing under a fresh bandage. The flyers and petty warnings disappeared. Meetings at the clubhouse, once tense affairs dominated by accusation and suspicion, became low-key gatherings focused on practical matters, cleaning up the community park, organizing a fall festival, setting up volunteer groups for elderly neighbors who needed help with maintenance. The heavy air of judgment that had once pervaded every street corner had lifted, replaced by a tentative sense of neighborliness that Mark recognized as fragile but promising. He wasn't naive. He knew that people rarely changed at their core, that fear and pettiness lurked just beneath the surface of many who now smiled and waved. But he also knew that sometimes the right kind of storm could wash away enough debris to make new growth possible. Mark himself stayed largely on the periphery. He wasn't interested in becoming a community leader or organizing potlucks. His satisfaction came from quieter victories. The slow repair of his battered porch, the steady expansion of his workshop where new projects took shape under his skilled hands, the simple act of drinking his coffee on the rebuilt steps without feeling the need to look over his shoulder. He spent more time outdoors now, letting the crisp air sharpen his senses, walking the perimeter of his property in the cool mornings, inspecting the mailbox that had, against all odds, become a symbol of quiet resilience. Its polished oak frame gleamed in the morning light, the brass plaque catching the sun's rays and throwing them back defiantly. Occasionally, neighbors would approach him during his walks, offering thanks not in the grand, awkward speeches of people seeking redemption, but in the small, honest gestures that mattered more. An offer of help carrying lumber, a box of late summer, tomatoes left on his porch, a simple handshake accompanied by a murmur of appreciation. Mark accepted these gestures with the same quiet dignity with which he had accepted everything else, neither seeking them out nor dismissing them. He understood that real change, real respect, was built not through grandstanding but through the slow accumulation of small acts, repeated steadily over time. There were still moments when the shadows of the past crept close, the sound of tires screeching in the distance, the sudden flash of a white SUV in the corner of his eye, but Mark had learned to let them pass through him like a cold wind. He refused to live chained to the memory of Karen's vendetta. He had earned his peace, and he intended to keep it, not by hiding but by living so solidly, so immovably, that no whisper or rumor could dislodge him. As Halloween approached, Mark watched with mild amusement as the new family decorated their porch with carved pumpkins and string lights, their children laughing and shrieking with delight as they chased each other across the lawn. For the first time in years, the neighborhood buzzed with genuine excitement. Not the manufactured camaraderie of forced gatherings, but the simple, unself-conscious joy that came when people stopped policing each other and started living alongside each other instead. One afternoon, as he was replacing a cracked stepping stone near the driveway, the young father, Tom, he'd learned his name was, walked over with a cautious smile and an offer. "We're setting up a little neighborhood barbecue next weekend," Tom said. "Nothing fancy. Burgers, hot dogs. Thought you might like to come by. No pressure." Mark straightened up, wiping the dust from his hands, considering the offer carefully. In another life, he might have declined without hesitation. Solitude had always been his refuge. But something in the boy's nervous posture, the tentative way he made the offer, touched a deeper chord. It wasn't about the food or the company. It was about acknowledging that he had fought for a place not just to exist, but to belong. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to step fully into that space. "I'll think about it," Mark said, and Tom grinned like a man who understood that this, from Mark, was as good as a yes. When the day of the barbecue arrived, Mark showed up late, bringing a stack of handmade wooden coasters he had carved himself as a quiet gift for the hosts. He stayed mostly on the edges of the gathering, nursing a beer, exchanging a few quiet words with neighbors who still seemed slightly unsure how to approach him. But when one of the little boys ran up to him, brandishing a toy airplane and demanding an audience for his latest daring stunt, Mark found himself laughing. A low, rough sound that felt unfamiliar but good, as he knelt to watch the kid demonstrate his acrobatics. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars pricked the darkening sky, Mark sat back in his chair, sipping his drink, feeling the steady thrum of conversation and laughter weaving through the air round him. It wasn't perfection. It never would be. But it was enough. It was life, messy and imperfect and unguarded, and it was his. Later that night, walking back across the lawn toward his porch, he paused for a moment beside the mailbox. He rested his hand lightly against the polished wood, feeling the solidity beneath his fingers, the coolness of the steel core hidden within. Built to last, he thought again, not just as a boast, but as a promise to himself. He would endure. He would live, and that would be victory enough.